I called my paper "The Readiness for Transference, Hamlet's Lesson." I vary Hamlet's saying, "To be in readiness, to be cheerful is everything." This is Freud writing in a letter to Fliess, the same letter in which he tells him that he's abandoning the theory of seduction. And this is a theory that he had harshly defended in the previous months or years against the disbelief displayed by his fellow physicians in Vienna. The loss is enormous for him, who adds, perhaps ironically, "I could indeed feel quite discontent. The expectation of eternal fame was so beautiful as was that of certain wealth." End of quote. Jean Laplanche considered that the abandonment of the theory of seduction was a real cataclysm, and he spent himself lots of energy putting it back in a generalized form, not in the same form as Freud, at the gravitational center of psychoanalytic theory. But whereas he denounces Freud's strayings, Laplanche is no less faithful to the Viennese founder of psychoanalysis, admiring his persistence in tracking down his object. Freud remains Freud, in other words. Even when temporarily he loses the north, so to speak, his thinking is all the same magnetized and rammed by his unceasing quest for the unconscious thing. In what follows, I propose to work on one aspect of what might be called, in a buzzword, Freud's resilience at the time of the cataclysm, in view of which I will let myself be guided by the very words of the letter in which he announces to Fliess the great secret. He starts the letter saying, "I have to tell you my great secret. I do not believe in my neurotica anymore." Neurotica being the code name for the seduction theory. At the end of that letter, after trying to talk about something else, Freud returns to the main event and concludes, I quote, "In this collapse of everything valuable, the psychological alone has remained untouched. The dream book stands entirely secure, and my beginnings of the metapsychological work have only grown in my estimation. It is a pity that one cannot make a living, for instance, on dream interpretation." End of quote. As we know, Freud ended up not only making a living on dream interpretation and the method of treatment derived from it, but also obtaining the much desired fame. Still, the cheerfulness he substitutes for Hamlet's readiness is surprising. After all, Freud has just lost sight of the sources of denial that he thought he had found with infantile seduction. At the moment of considering the sentence itself, I find it remarkable, therefore, that in this dramatic hour, Freud's thoughts turn to Hamlet. In fact, the tragedy Hamlet will be evoked again 3 weeks later in another important letter where Freud exposes to Fliess his understanding of Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and wonders if one could not find the same plot in the famous Shakespearean play. A parallel that he shall draw again and in more detail in the interpretation of dreams. So this is a very fertile period in Freud, and Hamlet seems to be at the center. What then of this appearance of the Prince of Denmark in the letter of the equinox, September 21 being the equinox, as Laplanche calls it? Let's start by noting that the phrase from Hamlet that Freud quotes and distorts is not just any sentence. In the preface, added 20 years later to his 1957 translation of Hamlet and King Lear, the French poet Yves Bonnefoy, a great French poet who recently died, I believe, concentrates on this one and only sentence: the readiness is all. In it, he sees the major key to the interpretation of the play. Yet, in place of the readiness, whose meaning, as we shall see, is not as obvious as it seems, Freud puts cheerfulness. In the German original, it reads, Heiter sein ist alles. Whereas, according to the German publishers of his correspondence, the correct rendition of the readiness is all should have been Bereitschaft ist alles, or Bereitsein ist alles. The adjective heiter, which can also mean serene, clear, or unclouded, was chosen. And his serenity, his clear mind, seems to astonish Freud himself. He mentions that he would rather have reasons to be quite discontent. Interestingly, the same word heiter was already present in the very first sentence of the same letter. Quote, here I am again, since yesterday morning, refreshed, cheerful, that is heiter, impoverished, end of quote. This double occurrence of the word heiter, in addition to its replacing Bereitschaft, which should have been there instead, makes it stand out from the dramatic background. One could see here a reaction formation, for instance, if we were to analyze Freud the man, which I won't. We shall see that the twice mentioned heiter will prove not so distant after all from Hamlet's readiness, and will even highlight an important aspect thereof. Readiness has many meanings. Among them, the word can signify the state of being ready or prepared, or of being willingly disposed. This ambiguity seems to me to be put to advantage by Shakespeare in the context of the play. On the one hand, the sentence is spoken when Hamlet prepares to meet Laertes in a sword duel. It is part of the answer the young prince gives to Horatio when the latter suggests to postpone the duel because, in his view, Hamlet is not ready, not fit enough. Readiness could therefore seem to mean being sufficiently prepared for combat. But as the rest of the scene suggests, and as Bonnefoy points out, Hamlet has something else in mind. His readiness is rather a matter of accepting the inevitable, whatever it may be, since, Hamlet adds, quote, there's a special providence in the fall of a sparrow, end of quote. Hamlet's readiness, therefore, is not truly or not only about being ready for the fight, for which he could have used the word preparedness, for instance, and we shall get back to this. It is striking that on the one hand, in 1957, Bonnefoy had translated the readiness is all by l'essentiel c'est d'être prêt. The essential thing is to be prepared. Whereas in the preface, 20 years later, he contrasts Hamlet's readiness with King Lear's ripeness in these terms. Quote, I will try to understand the availability in Hamlet and the ripening in King Lear. Je vais essayer de comprendre la disponibilité dans Hamlet, le mûrissement dans le roi Lear. Being ready is replaced, therefore, by Bonnefoy with being available. Then, with regard to the willingness to accept fate, Bonnefoy specifies that Hamlet does not accept it in a passive or discouraged way. And Bonnefoy adds, the readiness Hamlet proposes is not to rely on the divine will as guarantor of our effort, guardian of our meaning. It is, on the contrary, to stop doing what the God of old had expected of us, the bold and sustained exercise of our judgment in the world he has created, the appreciation of good and evil, to a thinking that foresees and organizes, and which can do so because it knows the values. Hamlet, this is still Bonnefoy speaking, Hamlet substitutes the reception of things as they come, as disordered and contradictory as they may be, end of quote. Remarkably, to the ear of an analyst, this commentary could, mutatis mutandis, apply to what Freud was experiencing when he wrote the letter I mentioned earlier. What Freud really announces in this letter is that he has given up not the theory of seduction itself, but the etiological role of the perverse acts of seduction that he had thought were the specific cause of the psychoneurosis. This etiological theory indeed placed seduction in the light of the appreciation of good and evil. It therefore entailed a judgment both of value, these acts are bad, pathogenic, and of existence, these acts actually occurred. As for the reflection about them, it served to plan and organize according to these values, that is, to yield a positive knowledge of the psychopathological becoming and of its treatment. After abandoning this etiological theory on the basis of several arguments expounded by Freud in the letter, he falls back on what, quote unquote, stands entirely secure, that is, the interpretation of dreams, which, as we know, requires precisely what Bonnefoy sees in Hamlet's availability, that is, quote, the reception of things as they come, as disordered and contradictory as they may be, end of quote. Mind you, I am not the least suggesting that in writing the quoted lines, Bonnefoy had in mind the Freudian method. However, I dare put his reading of Hamlet next to the fact that Freud, the great admirer of Shakespeare, strongly impressed by his great play, thinks precisely of Hamlet during this dramatic moment of his research. That Freud should indirectly quote Hamlet's readiness by substituting it with cheerfulness at the very moment when he too had somehow accepted fate seems to me usefully enlightened by Bonnefoy's remark about Hamlet's availability, as it evokes, unintentionally I suppose, precisely what Freud shall develop in the months and years following the dramatic turn of this letter. Do not the words of Bonnefoy indeed recall the fundamental rule that Freud was soon going to formulate on the basis of the study of dreams? Freud is therefore right at the end of his letter to console himself by noting that in this collapse of everything valuable, the psychological alone has remained untouched. The dream book stands entirely secure. It can therefore be said that Freud does not distort Hamlet's famous sentence that much after all. Freud's cheerfulness or serenity, if you want, is indeed one aspect of Hamlet's readiness as an acceptance of the inevitable to which Freud, just like Hamlet, does not resign himself in a passive or discouraged way. In view of the method that Freud developed following and despite the cataclysm on 97, by sticking to the solidity of his discoveries about the dream, there are grounds for paraphrasing another famous excerpt from Hamlet, the play. We would indeed be tempted to say there is method in such readiness. Indeed, the analytical method that emerged from the work on the dream contains two versions of readiness: free association on the part of the patient and evenly hovering attention on the part of the analyst. In both cases, it is recommended to suspend judgments of value and existence and to attend to what comes, as disorganized and contradictory as it may be. The parallel holds good up to the conclusion that Bonnefoy arrives at concerning availability. I quote, "I understand the readiness that appears in Hamlet as simply, negatively, a survival technique of the soul." End of quote. This was Bonnefoy. Visibly, for the development of my topic, I must navigate between languages, which is what the work of translation, that of Bonnefoy regarding Hamlet, that of Strachey or of Laplanche regarding Freud, not only invites, but also greatly enlightens. Whereas in his letter of 97, Freud opts for cheerfulness, Heitersein, rather than readiness, Bereitschaft, he will, however, one day turn his attention to this second term, Bereitschaft, because Bereitschaft and all that relates to it, such as the substantive Bereitung or the verb bereiten, to prepare, will take a major conceptual value in another major text of Freud, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. In it, Freud explains that trauma involves a breach in the stimulus barrier and that the ensuing fright, which is Schreck in German, is the result of a lack of any preparedness for anxiety, which in German writes Angstbereitschaft in a single word. Angst, anxiety, Bereitschaft, preparedness. Including lack of hypercataxis, this is Strachey translating, I'm afraid, of the systems that would be the first to receive the stimulus. Hence, you have to keep in mind here Angstbereitschaft, because it can be translated in two ways. Preparedness for anxiety is Strachey's way of translating the German compound word, whereas the French translators under Laplanche rendered it with preparedness by anxiety, not for anxiety. Such a variance is not merely a different choice of terms, it is a theoretical choice in the case of Laplanche. In purely linguistic terms, the two choices are equally justified. But in the context of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the French version gives anxiety a decisive role in the prevention of trauma, in that it triggers the preparation for the coming shock. In this regard, Strachey's choice for the English translation, preparedness for anxiety, is surprising, since as a footnote by his own hand attests, he well knew that Freud, a few pages earlier in the same work, had written the following, quote, "I do not believe that anxiety can produce traumatic neurosis. There is something about anxiety that protects its subject against fright, Schreck, and so against fright neurosis, which is traumatic neurosis." End of quote. Clearly then, anxiety, Angst, not only differs from fright or terror, Schreck, but serves to avoid it. Freud later explains that this is done by triggering an overinvestment of the receiving systems, which prevents the shattering of the stimulus barrier. But while the choice between for and by anxiety is certainly significant, this is not my main concern here. More important for my present purpose is the fact that Strachey translated Bereitschaft with preparedness and not with readiness, which this time I think is a rigorous choice, since as we have seen, readiness could mean the acceptance of the inevitable, whereas in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, there is no question of acceptance, but of preparation to counter the traumatic breach. Be it as a preparation for anxiety or a preparation by anxiety, the term preparedness is what matters here, in that it emphasizes that in this case, Bereitschaft does not involve any resignation. So, in this back and forth between languages, we find that the German Bereitschaft can be either rendered by Hamlet's readiness, as the German translators of the letters suggested, or by his availability, as Bonnefoy translates, or by preparedness in Freud Strachey, or apprêtement in Freud Laplanche. Let's keep at hand this readiness-preparedness polarity within the Bereitschaft, since it will help us to move further towards the question which is central to psychoanalysis, that is the question of transference. So I need to quote Bonnefoy again, the same long quote I already gave you. The readiness Hamlet proposes is not to rely on the divine will as guarantor of our effort, guardian of our meaning. It is to stop, on the contrary, what the God of old had expected of us. That is to stop the bold and sustained exercise of our judgment, etc., etc. To a thinking that foresees and organizes, and which can do so because it knows the values, Hamlet substitutes the reception of things as they come, as disordered and contradictory as they may be. I said that this is redolent of the Freudian method and its fundamental rule. Now, it is interesting to note that in the very pages where Freud describes and justifies this rule, the Bereitschaft is indeed invoked this time within the substantive Vorbereitung, which means a preparation, a previous preparation, so to speak. Freud writes indeed about the analytic method, quote, that it involves some psychological preparation, psychische Vorbereitung, of the patient. We must aim at bringing two changes in him: an increase in the attention he pays to his own psychical perceptions, and the elimination of the criticism by which he normally sifts the thoughts that occur to him. The quote continues, "It is necessary to insist explicitly on his renouncing all criticism of the thoughts that he perceives. We therefore tell him that the success of the psychoanalysis depends on his noticing and reporting whatever comes," and he uses here the word Einfall, which is the incidental thought, the thought that falls upon him, whatever comes into his head, and not being misled, for instance, into suppressing an idea because it strikes him as unimportant or irrelevant, or because it seems to him meaningless. He must adopt a completely impartial attitude to what occurs to him. It's again Einfalle, since it is precisely his critical attitude which is responsible for his being unable, in the ordinary course of things, to achieve the desired unraveling of his dream or obsessional idea, or whatever it may be. End of quote. In this double requirement, the intensification of attention draws on the one hand on preparedness. The analysand must endeavor to scrutinize his psychic landscape more attentively. On the other hand, the setting aside of criticism requires, I believe, readiness. That is, the willingness to accept all that comes into the field of intensified attention. It is there then a two-tiered and apparently contradictory process that seems to try and sway the analysand's mind, bending it on one direction to pay more attention and in the other to avoid sifting what comes up. Freud will further develop the description of this method by distinguishing between two sorts of attention: reflexive attention and self-observing attention. And this is also important, so I have to quote him again at some length. Quote, "In both cases, attention must be concentrated, but the man who is reflecting is also exercising his critical faculty. This leads him to reject some of the ideas that occur to him after perceiving them, to cut short others without following the trains of thought which they would open up to him, and to behave in such a way towards still others that they never become conscious at all and are accordingly suppressed before being perceived. The self-observer, on the other hand, need only take the trouble to suppress his critical faculty. If he succeeds in doing that, innumerable ideas, Einfälle, come into his consciousness of which he could otherwise never have got hold." End of quote. So this is really important, and we know that attention was a very important theme in Freud's thinking, neurological thinking as well, back in the Project for a Scientific Psychology that he never published. Attention then is a central element of the method, as long as we distinguish between its two forms. In another paper, I have indicated from which source stems the importance that Freud has always given to attention. Today, the British neuroscientist Carl Friston has brought back into the limelight the fundamental contribution of Hermann von Helmholtz, who was the leader of the physicalist school, of which was also part Brücke, that is Freud's boss at the time of his biological research in Brücke's laboratory. What may be called the Helmholtz principle states that the essential function of the central nervous system, and we translate for our purpose, the mind, is to keep free energy as low as possible, because a too high free energy level interferes with brain function. The relation to the outside world, this is still Helmholtz's principle, therefore requires the binding of free energy. And if we ask how this translates in psychological terms, Carl Friston, the contemporary neuroscientist, specifies that it is ultimately a question of avoiding surprise. It is a question of putting some order in the world, giving the subject a capacity of foresight or prediction, of getting ready for any eventuality, a preparedness then intended to avoid big surprises. Now, this is where we come back to Freud, because, okay, we know that Helmholtz, who influenced Freud for sure, who was one of the great minds of the 19th century in the German world, and actually he was well known outside of Germany as well. He made important discoveries. In other words, this pre-psychoanalytic influence on Freud certainly transpired in what he will do in his psychoanalytical work. And precisely if we go back now to Beyond the Pleasure Principle, about the avoidance of trauma through preparation by anxiety. Indeed, in this same text, Freud also posited, in terms very close to those of Helmholtz, that the binding of free energy, in his words, in Freud's words, it was the quantity of excitation, is a fundamental task of the psychic apparatus. The logic of the theory of trauma and of its possible avoidance is thus based on this primary function, on this very principle of binding the energy. But if in the light of this principle, we now examine what we have quoted above about the psychological preparation of the patient in analysis, we may note that the Freudian method aims at somehow diverting the psychic apparatus from its tendency to preparedness. You remember, Freud asked the patient to let go of his effort at criticizing what comes, at discarding ideas, and therefore to open up to possible unexpected ideas. A greater attention paid to internal perception, coupled with a withdrawal of criticism, must favor the appearance of incidental ideas, that is to say, unexpected ideas, quite literally falling upon the patient. The Freudian method of analysis, therefore, works against the fundamental principle of binding and seeks, on the contrary, to favor a certain surprise. Now, this is something that struck me. I should have noticed many years before, but it's in working on this question of readiness versus preparedness that it suddenly struck me how the Freudian method of analysis and the Freudian theory of trauma are at the extreme poles of a dialectic here. Thinking about it, what else could one expect from a method called psychoanalysis? Does not the lysis in analysis mean precisely unbinding or decomposition, the analysand has done his best all his life to bind the free energies, quote unquote, that assail him. That is, to master the consequences of events and situations for which the psyche was not prepared. The most primal of these situations being what Laplanche calls the fundamental anthropological situation, containing an asymmetry as for the sexual dimension between the infant and the adult caretaker. In Laplanche's theoretical frame, we find an equivalent of Helmholtz's free energy in the non-metabolizable part of the excitation due, according to Laplanche, to the enigmatic sexual lodged within the adult's messages of normal attachment. And all the more so, of course, in cases of perverse seduction, which are special cases of within a general theory of seduction, which a seduction that is unavoidably present in the child to adult relationship. Following this model, the subject can be exposed to disturbing events of variable intensity that may lead to dead ends in terms of symbolization or metabolization, if you want. The subject will one day report to us his or her unproductive efforts, and we start looking for more effective bindings. But these new links cannot be obtained without first unbinding, that is, undoing the pre-existing links that exist in his mind, the theories, the fantasies that have organized his being and his, sadly, his pathology as well. Analysis, it must be remembered, and this is Freud quoting Leonardo da Vinci, analysis proceeds per via di levare, that is by taking out things. The analysand would rather not have to go through such ordeal, but as the work of analysis is primarily devoted to unbinding, it can't help temporarily raising the levels of free energy. And this is not without causing moments of anxiety, a disturbance that the analysand would rather try to prevent. Such affinity of the analytical method with the model of the traumatic breach certainly does not mean that the analysts actually try to re-traumatize their patients. Yet, obviously, as a well-understood Freudian method of analysis contrasts with a certain contemporary predilection for techniques based on empathy, for instance, that seek, above all, an empathic communication between patient and analyst, as if one tried at any cost to avoid raising the levels of free energy in the patient. Yet, only such a raise can lead to the temporary unbinding needed for new symbolizations to happen in the après-coup. Après-coup being the French translation for Nachträglichkeit in Freud, which Strachey wrongly translated as deferred action, wrongly because deferred action is just one side of the après-coup. It is the later explosion of a time bomb, for instance. Whereas après-coup, Nachträglichkeit, means much more than that. It means that something happens after a first event can retrospectively give, for instance, a traumatic value to a previous event that had gone almost unnoticed. So it's a much more complicated story than just a deferred action. How indeed could the après-coup temporal dynamics operate if the analytic session did not offer opportunities for new après-coup? And here I have a play with words in French, because après-coup means after the blow, after the coup, if you want. And the word coup, which means a blow, is important because it means that in the analysis itself, there are some blows happening, although, as I said, We don't do that on purpose. We don't try to re-traumatize our patients, but certainly opening up and dismantling previous modes of linking, of binding, will certainly expose the patient to a certain degree of anxiety and will be felt at some point as a certain blow happening to them. Are there any questions at this point or comments?
So if we have a lot of free energy that's supposedly bad for your brain, what does it lead to?
I'm sorry, I missed a few words. Where does it?
What does it lead to?
If you have a lot of free, she said, if you have a lot of free energy, that's supposedly bad.
If you have a lot of free energy, depending on the level of free energy, it could lead to anxiety. Anxiety is the expression of free energy, of something that you cannot bind. If you have a lot of free energy arriving suddenly, you can have trauma. That is, think here of the soldier on the battleground, you know, who is expecting something terrible possibly happening, but then he really goes through seeing his comrade next to him being turned into pieces by the explosion of a missile, and he, however prepared he may have been, this will be a lot to take in, and his mind can be temporarily paralyzed, if not shattered, by the experience. So free energy, of course, we are talking here, free energy is a neurological or a metaphysical term, but what we mean here is the extent of the surprise due to unpreparedness. And this, we can never, as we will see in my next section, we can never be in a totally stable and bound state. That would be, the most bound state is called death, where no free energy exists anymore. But there is a question of, let's say, of an optimal level of free energy that entices the subject to seek, to discover, to think, to elaborate new solutions. But an extreme quantity of free energy can be disruptive and paralyzing and traumatizing. What is called today PTSD is exactly what Freud called fright neurosis, and in 1920, exactly.
So good. So the soldier can be prepared but not ready. Can anybody?
Yeah, well, he may think that he's prepared. You know, he may visualize and he has been informed and he has seen movies, or you know, he can be told. But when the real thing comes, I think no one is really prepared. You cannot, and people who come back from the battlefield tell as much. You know, they say as much, that they could never have expected what really happened to them.
So I guess I'm trying to get back to the opposition you were drawing between readiness and preparedness.
Yes.
And I guess the other question is, where did cheerfulness go? But so is readiness kind of an ideal that none of us are ever quite, or maybe even the other way around, or am I misunderstanding?
Well, I think that, for instance, the readiness to go to combat is probably, I don't know, a patriot is ready and willing, but this is at the level of perhaps the ideology or the sentiment. But when the breach in his psychic system occurs because of the intensity of the impact, I think that the readiness then is really not sufficient. And he will have also prepared, you know, really trained and being informed and so on. But again, it's always a question of quantity. The aspect of quantity, which Freud called the economic point of view of metapsychology, is very important. And we cannot really go into that at this time, but it's the aspect of trauma is a question of quantity.
Go ahead.
This sounds to me a lot like a confidence situation where we can't actually understand our capabilities. I think of Dunning-Kruger syndrome, wherein the person does not actually have an objective measure of his abilities or his confidence. He may be overconfident, or he may not be aware of how capable he is to achieve something. And I'm thinking that that's what this seems to be focusing on.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes, of course, extreme situations can elicit in us responses that we didn't think we have. And this is on the good side of the story. But I think that for most people, it's the opposite. That is, we think we are ready, but then the horror is so much that really we discover too late that we were not really prepared, that we are not really ready to face that sort of horror. Representation is never really an account of what presents itself. The experience of what presents itself is not really entirely gathered into the energy of a representation. A representation is always but a limited experience compared to the real thing happening.
So thinking about anxiety preparing one, sort of rehearsing, yes, for the Einfall. One of the issues about Hamlet is that it's a very long play, and Hamlet is delaying the revenge. And this question of delay has come up not only amongst literary critics saying, what's wrong with Hamlet? Why is he delaying? But even an entire nation, namely the nation of Germany, took on the question of Deutschland is Hamlet. Why is Germany delaying becoming a nation? What is going on in Germany? And then when the far right came in, the far right said, all right, we're not Hamlet anymore. We've now seized the power.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. I'm starting to see Hamlet a bit differently now in listening to you speak, and I'm wondering if, like, as he's going through this, partly he's thinking through philosophy, but partly he's thinking through worst case scenarios. He's thinking through all of these horrible things that people are. He's thinking about maggots, and part of what he's doing here is unbinding the synthesis that he has. And by the time we get to the fifth act, he's ready to bind into a new synthesis that says, okay, I'm ready. Let's do this last thing here.
That's fascinating. I don't have anything to add to that. I think it's beautifully said. As a counterpart to the unbinding that the method entails, the analytic frame with its containing function is there to ensure that the rise in free energy does not exceed a certain threshold. But within this framework, another phenomenon arises, custom-made, as it were, to ensure that the surprise is already partially countered by a new type of binding. A new type, that new for the patient, that is, but not so new as we shall see. This phenomenon is none other than the transference. As we have seen, the method that invites unbinding requires of the analysand a readiness to be surprised by incidental ideas, thus to let the free energy rise, if we want to speak in those terms. But that never goes without a movement in the other direction, as if something were already in place, ready to absorb some of the energy unleashed by the method. At one point, Freud speaks of stereotype plates. In German, it's the word cliché, which perhaps is interesting in itself. Something like printing plates ready to at hand for issuing new editions of old relational and affective configurations. This type of transference was dubbed by Laplanche filled-in transference. It is a kind of transference where the analysand's response is almost predictable from what is known about his past history, a response that is to the unbinding provocation by the analytic situation, by the analyst. Seen in this light, the binding effect of the transference works against the disposition to let the incidental ideas come in. It guards against any surprises by reproducing situations already experienced. As Freud noted, transference is resistance. Fortunately, it's a resistance that will prove useful in the long term, because by bringing back old situations in a new context, that gives the opportunity for an après-coup effect on these old situations. The parallel between analytic and traumatic unbinding still holds for what regard another phenomenon of repetition, which is the free energy, which is triggering the repetition compulsion. Indeed, if the blows due to the analytic method are like micro-traumatic events, the emergence of the transference is itself of the order of repetition. So interestingly, in real traumatic experiences such as combat neurosis, you have patients who come back from the battlefield with repetition compulsion, with these intrusive, vivid visualizations of the horror of combat, of what they see, what they have seen, what they went through, and it repeats itself over and over. Well, you could say that at the micro level of the analysis, the same happens, but this time with the repetition in the transference. However, the containing structure offered by the analyst as guardian of the setting and of the method creates a situation very different from that in which full-blown traumas have occurred. The readiness of the patient to allow a certain unbinding combines not only with the analyst's capacity for containing and the reliability of the frame, but also with another readiness. I am speaking here of the analyst's own readiness, not only to hear, but also to let him or herself get caught, as it were, in the net of the transference. The analyst, that is, who by the simple act of instituting the inevitably seductive analytic situation provokes the transference, this is Laplanche speaking, I would say. It's not him speaking, but it's his ideas. The analyst must therefore possess a double disposition. On the one hand, a preparedness manifest in setting up the framework and the refusals it imposes. On the other hand, a readiness to welcome the transference in its actuality, that is, not only as a repetition of a thing of the past, but as a new fact happening in the present, a fact which now truly concerns the analyst. The analyst's availability, or following a term I now borrow from Lyotard, his passibility, P-A-S, not possibility, but passibility, being passible of, is thus engaged in a more radical way. It is a matter of letting oneself be reached without neither colluding with the positive transference nor retaliating against negative transference. Something which does not go without failures, of course, on the part of the analyst. It cannot always be kept at the perfect level, such an attitude. But these are failures that Winnicott considered not only inevitable, but even necessary. The combination of preparedness and readiness in the analysand, as in the analyst, makes of transference a system that we could describe as metastable, in the sense that the philosopher Gilbert Simondon, often quoted by Deleuze, gives to this term. A metastable system of organization is one still capable of evolving because it has not exhausted its potential or free energy. It has not reached the zero level of available energy. Contrary then to what may ordinarily be wished for outside of analysis, the transferential link is not at all expected to stabilize itself, since it is metastability which allows the continuation of the working through of the analysis. The establishment and maintenance of the frame on the one hand, and the provocation of the transference, coupled with the availability or passibility of the analyst on the other hand, allow for a relatively controlled unbinding and rebinding, yet still open to surprise. Now, here I would like to introduce very briefly another description of the same thing that I've been saying, and this time not by Laplanche, but by another major French analyst whom I respected and admired. He died last year, unfortunately, Michel de Musan, who, under the name of psychological chimera, has formulated a powerful metaphor for describing this metastable evolutive situation. The chimera is a fabulous child, he wrote, resulting from the meeting between the patient's and the analyst's unconscious. The life of this hybrid being follows an original course, specific, of course, to each particular case or to each particular dyad. In this respect, the disposition of the analyst must, according to de Musan, go so far as to tolerate a certain degree of depersonalization. He goes as far as saying this, that the analyst must accept to feel depersonalized at some point, because indeed the chimera manifests itself as a paradoxical system in which it is sometimes not easy to determine to whom belong the thoughts or incidental ideas obtained through the analytic method. De Musan's is certainly a radical conception, but a most important one in terms of availability or passibility. It is the greatest possible readiness offered jointly and yet opposite to any preparedness. The chimera is a composite being. It metastabilizes the transferential process, but it also has a life of its own and is therefore not entirely subject to a will external to it. In other words, neither patient nor analyst at some point can really interfere with the evolution of that state of affairs without risking to destroy it. The two participants in the analytic situation are at the same time spectators of its autonomous course. The chimera therefore supposes in both of them a disposition to welcome the surprises brought about by this evolving nature. Attenuated surprises, to be sure, and thus less likely to cause psychic paralysis, but surprises all the same, attesting the vitality of the analytic process. A closer view suggests that the analyst who hosts the transference must lend him or herself to a sort of controlled dissociation, a dissociation between the role of guardian of the frame and the disposition to welcome and contain paradoxical thoughts, that is what de Musan calls a certain degree of depersonalization. To accept, therefore, a certain madness insofar as it is bound by a method. Therefore, Polonius's phrase, though this be madness, yet there is method in it, could again be paraphrased by us here. Though this be method, yet there is some madness in it. Question or comments at this point before I read the last part? I think that the repetition compulsion is really the discovery, the major discovery in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Although he had already spoken of repetition 5 years before, at least, but the repetition as a compulsion is something much more sturdy, much more important. However, I think that repetition compulsion has nothing pathological in itself. It's uncanny. It creates uncanny situations, of course. But when you think of it, repetition and redundancy are the very essence of living systems. A living system must repeat itself day after day, reconstruct its own stature, its own structure, and preserve it, and when it's broken, redo it again and again. Otherwise, it will die. So repetition in itself is not something that I think we should be scared of. But of course, the question is the repetition encased into a loop, an unproductive loop, so as in PTSD, for instance, as we were saying earlier, or is it a repetition that can bring even small differences that in the long run will lead in a much different direction than expected. And I think that this is what happens in the analytic room. The patient repeats, but this time there is someone listening differently to what is repeated. Whereas let's say in his family as a kid, he would get the same answer that maintained the repetition, the loop, unproductive loop. But this time there's someone listening, someone taking in the transference and returning perhaps a slightly different response, slightly different comment that can make a great difference in the long run, as you know, in every non-linear dynamic system, as you know.
I just wanted to add something. The repetition compulsion, it would go away eventually.
I think that we hope that the sterile loop of repetition would go away or would be limited to a small corner of the mind. But I think that repetition is all the time with us. Even, you know, Freud himself, I think, said at some point that he realized that he was always writing about the same thing in different ways. Novelists say the same thing, you know, that there is a certain repetition. Of course, what matters is that the repetition, and here de Musin has written a very beautiful paper distinguishing between repetition of the identical and repetition of the same. It might look just like a play with words, but he makes a very strong point about distinguishing between the two. This paper was translated into English in the Psychoanalytic Quarterly around 2006 or 2007. And it's, to me, a very important paper because it tells us that repetition in itself is not the problem, but a mind that has been paralyzed, that has been traumatized, will be prisoner of repetition of the identical, except that an analyst who listens carefully, even in the case of what appears to be a constant repetition of the identical thing, can at some point display this minimal detail that if caught in the ear of the analyst can perhaps make a lot of difference, and then make the repetition go a bit astray and give something that is similar but not identical. And this little difference can go a long way and open up for a creative evolution of the situation. I don't want to look too optimistic. I know from my own practice that this is not a celebratory a victory over repetition. We know how those who practice analysis know how this is really the cross that we bear during all our practice. But fortunately, otherwise, as de Musin said, if the death drive is really what Freud thinks it is, we should close shop. There would be no hope. On what then can the analyst rely when making him or herself available so as not to skid uncontrollably? I propose that it's still on the entirely secure thing that comforted Freud in the fall of '97 when he lost sight of the sources of denial. I am talking of the model of the dream and the metapsychology derived from it. Except that nowadays a misunderstanding reigns on this subject. While there is still a general agreement that the interpretation of dreams is Freud's chef-d'oeuvre, major work, it is not at all obvious that its central tenets are currently taken into account. The impression one gets from many contemporary publications is that the dream is no longer an object of analysis and that analysts stay mainly at the level of the manifest content. The analyst's rêverie, a Bionian concept, is frequently invoked today. Bion is very popular the world over right now. But it often seems to be used as a direct provider of unconscious content rather than a precondition for a better listening. It is probably worth remembering that in good Freudian logic, the royal road to the unconscious is the analysis of the dream, not the dream itself. He is often misquoted as, oh, the dream is the royal road. No, the analysis of the dream. A dream is there for us, an analyst, to be analyzed. It's not to be taken at face value, and certainly not as giving a direct access to the unconscious. I am not lamenting this deviation for the sake of orthodoxy. This is an eminently practical issue in my view. The problem is that the celebration of reverie, for instance, for itself, without calling upon the witch metapsychology, as Freud called it, has the paradoxical effect of giving the analyst's associations a preponderant weight, and moreover to shield them against the methodological doubt and suspicion required of any analyst confronted with what seems obvious. Admittedly, it is indispensable during our listening to indulge in a dreaming thought, as Pontalis called it, pensée rêvante, and to let oneself be caught up, as already mentioned, in the transference. But this does not dispense the analyst from maintaining an evenly distributed attention as a counterpoint to the associations of the patient. So I'm here again referring to this dissociation in the this controlled dissociation needed in the analyst to be at the same time available, totally available, and yet holding the wheel for the conduct of the analysis. But evenly distributed does not imply that anything goes. It means above all a constant work of rebalancing, of opposing a healthy skepticism to what seems self-evident, being particularly wary of the possible misguiding role of affects. This is another important problem. Today, many analysts report their work as being guided by their feeling, their immediate feeling, or that of the patient as a proof of the truth of what's going on. Whereas the metapsychology that Freud taught us shows that this can be really a misguiding role of the affects, that affects can be displaced from one representation to another, and therefore they can lead us astray from what is really going on. The reverie occurring in the session is not a point of arrival. It is still only one aspect of the readiness of the analyst's disposition to hear better. The analyst's task is to take note of the crop of reveries and analyze them in order to orient himself, herself. Nothing forbids an interpretation from taking a poetic turn to be a dreaming utterance, even carrying something apparently crazy. But if the madness of transference and countertransference must be tolerated, it does not exempt us from having to maintain a method within it, just with a reference to the play again. The method that is called for in these circumstances is still made of readiness, but here caution is warranted. If the analyst is to indulge in his or her own reverie, she must avoid using it to saturate the paths of thinking that open up during the session. On the contrary, she must work to constantly offer a holo to the transference of the analysand, a holo likely to accommodate, and this is Laplanche, another holo. That is that besides the filled-in transference that I spoke of earlier, there is another aspect of transference, which is reached only if we are ready to tolerate a lot of apparently nonsense or a void of representations or a void of memory and so on, and an effect that presents itself as a holo. Indeed, another surprise of the analytic situation is that transference does not always present an identifiable content, not always a filled-in transference. On the contrary, transference can present itself as a void of representations, as a repetition, that is, of the subject's primordial confrontation with the enigmatic, as the actual experience of a failure of translation. And in another important letter of a year before the one that started this paper, this is how Freud defined repression, a failure of translation, which is a totally different view of repression than the one that is extracted from his published papers. And it's a pity that although tacitly Freud uses that definition of repression in many occurrences, but he never publicly really expounded the theory of repression as a problem, a failure in translation, which is, I think, a very, very productive avenue to follow. The actualization of the primordial situation presents itself as a holo-dat transference and requires that the analyst offer a matrix, so to speak, within which the unconscious seeds for the processes of representation and fantasy building can be patiently cultivated. Here I am referring to another paper that I had written a year before, where I discuss the question of unconscious fantasies. I do not think that, strictly speaking, there are unconscious fantasies. There are preconscious, there can be deeply preconscious fantasies, but for a question of theoretical rigor and epistemology, we certainly cannot state that there are unconscious fantasies, because if there were, we could not know about them. It goes, and when they emerge in the course of analysis, if fantasies emerge, there is no way of showing that they were not constructed during the session. So it's a question of methodology, epistemology, and of sheer logic in the Freudian framework. It goes without saying that in practice, one cannot always neatly distinguish between filled-in and hollowed-out forms of transference. As a clinical phenomenon, transference is structured in the manner of a dream or a symptom in which one can detect recurring patterns made of an actual, or I use actually in a very special sense here, an actual nucleus. When I wrote this book about the actual unconscious, this is what actual means. That is something that is there outside of the chronology. An actual nucleus, therefore a holo, coated with a properly psychic representational layer. What, on the other hand, is offered by the analyst as a holo matrix is for Laplanche essentially made of the analyst's refusals. Refusals of what? First among these, the things he refuses him or herself is the refusal to know, a refusal of preparedness, with readiness taking its place. In a similar perspective, de Musin speaks of a necessary fundamental silence of the analyst, an atemporal silence which he calls the mouth of the unconscious. By fundamental silence, de Musin does not trivially mean that the analyst should refrain from speaking. He rather means offering the analysand a listening like no other, I quote, a fundamental silence where the analyst collects and remembers all the messages coming from his own unconscious, and especially that of his patient, and this would be, according to the Musin, the active agent of healing, end of quote. The analyst's refusals and fundamental silence indicate that the analytic procedure is a mixture of method and availability, of containment and openness to what comes forward. It is this, not the least passive availability or passibility of the analyst that constitutes, in my view, what Bonnefoy said of Hamlet's readiness, that is, a survival technique of the soul. Thank you for your attention.
Something that I'm considering, and this may be more a comment than a question, but what are the implications for our understanding of Hamlet? Does this have potential to reconfigure our understanding of the prince, his motivations, how it's interpreted by directors, possibly?
I wish I were a Shakespeare scholar, which I'm not. So I will leave to Shakespeareans to eventually make use of, if anything useful is in this paper for them, to make use of these ideas. But very, from the dilettante's point of view, my most important impression was that there was and this is interesting because the other day I was reading, the philosopher George Steiner died a few weeks ago, and I was reading a piece by him where he compared Shakespeare to Dante, for instance, and saying that, or to Goethe, and saying, by quoting other authors, he was so erudite, he quoted 100 others in a paragraph, that to him, Shakespeare was not of the same kind of author, that whereas Dante or Goethe were bringing forward a soul of theirs, that they were introducing into the world something like a soul, and they were therefore what the German word Dichter is about. That is not simply a poet or a writer, but someone who really opens up a new universe, so to speak. Whereas Shakespeare went, according to Steiner, went here and there in comedy, in tragedy, and he was, playing with words. He was more a creator of language, he says. But in my view, I think that Hamlet is perhaps, if what Steiner says is true, I'm not in the capacity of saying, I would say that Hamlet is certainly an exception in that direction, because I think that Hamlet has really opened up, and Freud didn't miss that, that it is actually even more of a model of a soul than Oedipus. I think Hamlet is more important than Oedipus from a Freudian point of view. And Freud seemed to think that it was at least on an equal footing with Oedipus. And I think that all we can infer in Hamlet about the unconscious guilt, about who is the real murderer, the power of the desire for murder, and all the apathy that is created in him as a response to that guilt, and all the hesitancy, but which finally ends up, as Christian was saying, or I don't remember who said that. One of you said it. That there is finally this moment of truth, we could say, in this readiness to, okay, let this last thing happen. Let me open up to whatever comes. I am ready. I think that this is a very important important aspect. But again, I wouldn't dare pronounce myself as an expert in Shakespeare, which I am not.
Well, if I can kind of respond to both, I mean, is the implication then that maybe Hamlet is healthier than some readings of the play might suggest? And I guess I'm thinking, and I don't remember the argument that well, but Lacan is so interested in the foils, right? And in the exchange of the foils as some sort of, display of the Oedipal dynamic. And you're interested in the moment before that, right? Getting ready for that, or Freud is, or Lacan is. So kind of getting into this kind of preparedness or readiness for what will come as a way to kind of engage the truths of analysis. Does that suggest that maybe Hamlet is in a better place before the end of the play than maybe we suggested or thought?
Yeah. Again, but we can also say, at least this is me speaking, that we don't know if he really gets there. But yes, there is certainly an opening there.